Did the Democratic Party use undemocratic means to remove its presidential candidate, Joe Biden, and replace him with Kamala Harris? Here's Republican Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton on CNN with Josh Berman Tuesday. Let's see what he had to say.
You used the language coup, and again, you've never said that for January 6th, and as far as I know, no cops were beaten up, no one defecated in the Capitol, there was no criminal trespass in terms of changing the Democratic candidates, were there?
Well, no, but what you get with Kamala Harris is a failed prosecutor who wouldn't seek the death penalty for cop killers, even though her fellow San Francisco Democrat Dianne Feinstein wanted to.
So he didn't directly answer that question. But meanwhile, journalist Michael Shellenberger has posted a video on X in the hours following Biden's exit announcement castigating the Democratic Party for installing Harris in Biden's stead in the 2024 race. Let's watch.
But the party undermined the spirit of democracy in every election. Democracy at its core is about letting the people decide for themselves. That didn't happen. In fact, a very small number of Democratic Party donors and media elites chose Hillary Clinton, Biden, and Harris. Nobody could watch the events of the last few weeks and believe that the Democratic Party is democratic. It's a party controlled by the media, donors, and the deep state. However one feels about the GOP, the same can't be said for Republicans. Republican voters rejected their own party leaders, donors, and the foreign policy establishment to nominate Trump for president in 2016.
Shellenberger called out Democrats again on Tuesday. Let's look.
The war on democracy led by Democrats, the press, and the deep state has in this way ultimately helped Trump gain support. At the same time, it's left Democrats without good options to defeat him. By favoring woke racialist politics over a substantive political platform, and by selecting nominees in an anti-democratic process for 3 presidential elections in a row, Democrats have been left with an extremely weak candidate.
Here to discuss what's unfolding in the presidential race is Michael Shellenberger. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Robbie.
Always a pleasure. So I agree with you, but I want to let you lay out the case. You know, we've been going back and forth on this all week. I do think I'm not saying making the claim that it was illegal or some kind of law was violated. The Democratic Party is a sort of a private organization that can pick its candidate however they want. And in olden times, it was not done democratically on either side, Republican or Democrat. There was a smoke-filled room where they decided who the best candidate was. Now, that's kind of how they're doing it now. And I do think that flies in the face a little bit is in tension with their stated values of saying we're the ones who uphold democracy.
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, it's called the Democratic Party. And so the most important part of democracy is the people choose. And that is not happening here, obviously. So we're seeing, and it's a pattern. As we saw in 2016, that the DNC manipulated both its spending and also other aspects of that race to favor Hillary Clinton over Bernie Sanders. It's so extreme that Donna Brazile, a DNC leader, condemned it later. In 2020, you saw party elders moved Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar out of the primaries so that Bernie Sanders could split the vote with Elizabeth Warren, and Biden could get the nomination. And now here we see a situation where the Democratic primary voters are not choosing Kamala Harris. There was no moment in which they're choosing him. We thought maybe there would be a divide in the party and that you would see this conflict resolve at the DNC Democratic National Convention in August, and Obama, I guess, is still holding out. I think to his credit, it's something that really should be decided by Democratic primary voters. If that's impossible, then at least by the delegates to have some sort of democratic process, and that's not happening. So I just think one of the questions is, how did a party that was so committed to questioning authority, to fighting the man, this is the Democrats of the 80s and 90s that I was raised with, how did it go to becoming, so deferent to authority and so committed to these kind of backroom tactics?
Now, this was a ticket, Harris was on it, that got 81 million votes, the most ever in American history. This is a candidate that someone voted for. She's an incumbent. She's on the ticket. It was a popular decision. 65% of Democrats wanted Joe Biden to step down. Typically, what we see with a coup is that a sitting leader is deposed by a new leader, and that is not a decision that's popularly backed by the people. So I'm curious about the decision to use the word coup and how you see this as somehow different and more so a coup than January 6th.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I agree with you. I think the word coup is too strong, and it's not a word that I've used. And so that's not the word I would use. Although I would point out, by the way, that it's not correct to say that all coups are unpopular. In fact, we've seen in many situations, I mean, the one I'm familiar with is the Brazilian military coup. It was popular at first. And so the idea that a coup is only something unpopular, I don't think is true. And look, I think that we have a process. If the president steps down, then it makes sense that the vice president takes the president's role. That's in the Constitution. That's something that we all understand. That's what she was elected to be, was the vice president. She was never nominated to be the president, to be the Democratic presidential candidate. And so then there's this idea, well, Joe Biden will simply pass the torch, but that's not a democratic process. In other words, you can't say, oh, because the people elected Joe Biden and then he then goes and appoints Kamala Harris, that his appointment is democratic. It's bureaucratic. And so, I mean, at a minimum, there should be some open process at the convention. It's the perfect place to have an open process, to have a debate about this. And to be fair, I don't think that I'm not the only person pointing this out. I was happy to discover that Black Lives Matter, which is an organization I mostly disagree with, also holds this view. I think that many actually on the left of the Democratic Party, the more anti-establishment left wing of the Democratic Party, is also bothered by this. So, I think coup is too strong, but I think that there's a lot of space in between something being a coup and being democratic.
Yeah, the complicating factor here is that Biden did not have a really robust base of support in the first place. I mean, he did win. The process to make him the nominee this time around was something of a sham. There was not a competitive primary held. They didn't do debates. It was set up to be a coronation because their view is, well, he's the incumbent president, and the incumbent president doesn't get a real primary challenge situation, even though this is kind of an unprecedented situation because he's so old and people are concerned about that and voters were concerned about that. And a majority of Democrats were concerned about that in the first place, continued up until he stepped aside to think somebody else should be the candidate. So I think it's not like the actual wishes of the Democratic base have necessarily been betrayed in having Biden no longer be the candidate. But at the same time, nor is their will for Kamala Harris being expressed. Does that make sense? It's like it was undemocratic how we got here, and it's undemocratic how we're getting out of it. So it's not quite like, right, if Republican elites somehow finagled it so that Trump was not the candidate, that would be a massive betrayal of a base that is full-throatedly, whole hog, totally in support of Donald Trump. In this case, it's like, well, people did actually want a different candidate. We're just arriving at a different candidate through the donors and the elites choosing to have a different candidate, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it absolutely makes sense. And I think that, so you sort of see two problems here. First is that simply anointing Kamala Harris is neither consistent with the spirit of democracy or the letter of democracy, in the sense that, I mean, I voted for Biden in 2020. It was the last year of my life I was a registered Democrat. I changed my affiliation the following year. But part of the sell, I think everybody remembers, is that Biden was going to be a transitional, stabilizing figure, and that one of his first press conferences in 2021, reporters were hounding him about whether he would run for re-election again. The idea that somehow his age only became a concern after the debate is just not the case. It was a huge concern before that. So I think a lot of people with goodwill, they said, well, we'll give Biden, a sort of a transitional period, and then we'll move on to a process of choosing somebody, having a proper primary. That didn't happen this year. That this would have been the right time to have a proper primary. That didn't happen. So both the letter of the law, so to speak, and the letter of choosing directly of registered Democratic voters and, being able to select their candidate, that simply didn't happen this year. And I think a really interesting question is why is it that the Democrats which had been the party of liberalism and the party that really affirms the liberal democratic process, why have they been so willing to go along with the establishment and the elites in the party, both the media elites, the donor elites? And, I point out, again, I'm saying this as a former Democrat and independent, the Republicans rejected the party elite. They rejected the Republican establishment to go with a populist candidate in the form of Donald Trump. After significant efforts to get him out of there, they continued to go with Trump. So I do think what's sort of maybe we haven't talked enough about, it's not remarked upon enough, is just the ways in which the Republican Party has come to embody, and I think it's that libertarian wing, that populist wing, has embraced a kind of anti-establishment ethos, whereas you've seen the Democrats just continue to double down on a more pro-establishment process and candidate.
Now, Michael, when someone's on a ticket, a presidential ticket, and they're getting the most votes ever given to a ticket before, it's assumed that whoever's the vice president would be the president upon Joe Biden stepping down or what have you. Now, they're the incumbent ticket, and 65% of Democrats wanted this to happen, wanted Joe Biden to step aside. And at this point, holding a primary would be very difficult, an open primary. There was an open primary. And in 2020, to get Biden on the ticket, yes, I worked on the Bernie Sanders campaign. It was unfortunate, but it was representative of the majority of the party being more aligned with the establishment Democrats. We did not have the numbers for Bernie Sanders to win unless the establishment Democrats split the ticket. So to protect their ideology and their faction within the party, they came together and supported Biden. That was what happened democratically within the party, whether we like it or not. And of course, parties get to decide who the candidate will be. That is what is legal under our current democratic structure. I think to say that this isn't democracy when this is legally how our democracy runs is a bit of a stretch, because I haven't heard anyone in the Democratic Party complain about this and say, this was a coup, we should have an election, this was something that is undemocratic, because what we're worried about is jeopardizing our democracy in a way that Donald Trump does, which is forbidding the checks and balances in our government, which is something entirely different. This is someone that 81 million people voted for to potentially be president and to serve at the highest office in the administration besides Joe Biden's presidency. So I don't see how this is undemocratic, and to me it feels a little dishonest coming from people outside of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can see that point. I mean, I think, though, that you have to remember there is still a party convention coming up. It would have been a perfect time and place to have that conversation. I think Democratic voters are more than capable of having spent several weeks hearing from different candidates, having it culminate in the Democratic National Convention, having a vote there. I mean, that is how the party used to select candidates. I think it's not right to just point to polling saying, oh, a majority of Democrats wish to have Kamala Harris as their candidate. A poll is not the same thing as an election. It's not the same thing as a process. There is democratic processes that need to occur. And that is actually the tradition in the United States to have those. Like I said, I think there's nothing illegal about it. I certainly haven't used the word coup. I think that's far too strong. But at the same time, I don't think this really represents a kind of democratic process by any means. You really didn't have an open primary earlier this year for Biden. There really wasn't a chance for a fair competition between candidates. And look, I think the consequences are clear, which is that the Democrats are left with a candidate who is not strong. I pointed out in those articles that I did that Kamala Harris was really quite coddled as a candidate her entire political career. First, she was appointed to statewide positions by her boyfriend at the time, Willie Brown, a major politician in California. She then cruised through to becoming elected district attorney, attorney general, senator without having significant competition. It's sort of a classic case of coddling where when you coddle somebody, they're not battle hardened, they're not strengthened, they haven't faced that adversity for the real world. And I think you're left down with a candidate who speaks in platitudes, who often appears to be constantly trying to figure out what to say so she doesn't get in trouble, rather than what to do. And this latest thing is with this idea of whether or not she was really in charge of the border. Turns out, I mean, we're going to call about it now. She actually had broader responsibilities. It was to stem the root causes of the migration crisis. So to now see her and her allies in the media suggest that somehow she didn't have a significant role when it came to the migration crisis, I just think speaks to the unwillingness to take responsibility for the powers that she's had, the extraordinary powers she's had her political career, and never wielded with any authority, or vision, and is now in a position where she's competing for specifically that role of visionary and commander in chief.
I think it goes to show you the kind of media coverage she's going to get, where Axios today, to your point, saying that, oh, she was never officially the border czar, what are you talking about? And then immediately Community noted with all the time, there's 3 separate times they referred to her in Axios as the border czar.
Now, you can make a deliberate decision to not listen to her speeches where she is talking about policy positions. She's so far given 3 speeches over the last week where she's focused on policy. You had Biden himself say, when he hadn't stepped down yet, at the convention, delegates can go and vote for whoever they want. That's how our process works. That was before he endorsed Harris. We're still having a democratic process at the convention. Delegates get to choose who they pledge for, and I'm just not convinced this is anything more than people afraid of Kamala Harris doing very well and being a real threat to Trump.
Oh, but some people are, I'm afraid of her not doing very well because she's not been tested, but we'll have to leave it there. Michael Shellenberger, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, guys.